Good afternoon. I've got the thumbs up, so I believe we are ready to start. I am Cleveland Johnson, the Executive Director of the Morris Museum, and I'm very happy to welcome you all today to this special event. Actually, today's Tea and Talk is one of the only things on our Morris Museum calendar that's actually happening at the same time that it would normally have happened at, and in fact has very much the same content as it would have had if we were still all meeting in person. One small difference is that since our daily routines have been turned upside down, we do have a lot of members, a lot of board members, a lot of museum staff joining us today who would normally be tied up with other responsibilities on a Thursday afternoon. So I welcome all of you. It's great to have this expanded audience for what I'm certain will be an engaging hour or two. Before handing over the microphone, so to say, I do have a few quick thank yous. First of all, Brett Messenger. Many of you know Brett as our Curatorial Director of Live Arts. Brett has learned this technology and is piloting this event off screen. Brett is also managing the museum's social media activities now that the Morris Museum, for better or for worse, is a completely digital institution. If you aren't following our daily activity on Facebook and Instagram, I encourage you to do so. That's where it's all happening right now. Special thanks to Hannah Millen, our manager of individual giving. All of you members will know Hannah. She is keeping our members apprised weekly of what's going on behind the scenes and out of sight at the museum these days. Please keep your eyes open for weekly membership news from Hannah. There are more fun things ahead. I know at least that I'm on tap myself to do something for you, something that involves a piano, so stay tuned for that. Special thanks to all of you members out there who are sticking with us through thick and thin during these challenging times. With our largest revenue streams completely dried up for now, seeing your membership renewals and other donations show up in the mailbox are truly bright spots in our lives. Now let me introduce to you our Chief Curator, Ronald T. Labaco. Ron, for many years, has championed the work of Eva Zeisel, working with Jean Richards, Eva Zeisel's daughter, whom he'll introduce in just a moment. Ron has mounted an inspiring exhibit of Zeisel's work in our Tregenza Gallery. If you haven't had a chance to see it in person, never fear, we will extend that exhibition by several weeks at least once we reopen, so you'll be able to catch it. Now, without further ado, let me finally give my first personal thanks to you, Jean Richards, for being with us today, for joining us in this event. And I will turn this over now to you, Ron. Thanks all.
Great, thank you, Cleveland. And I am delighted to be part of the Morris Museum's first teleconference Tea and Talk. And I can't think of a more appropriate subject matter, Eva Zeisel, and because of all of the tea sets that she's designed over the course of her lifetime. So I think she is having a cup of tea with us in spirit as we have this program. So welcome everybody. I hope that everybody has had a chance to see the exhibition, Eva Zeisel, A Century of Designing Elegance, which Cleveland had mentioned. It features over 129 works spanning from 1926 to 2017, which pales in comparison to the over 100,000 designs that, to Eva Zeisel's credit, by her own estimation. The majority of these are drawn from the collection of Jean Richards, except for one set that was produced in New Jersey. So that's the New Jersey connection that Jean will be able to tell us about later in the program. Just really quickly, I am going to read the introduction panel to the exhibition because it just gives an incredible overview of Eva Zeisel's incredible contribution to the look of the 20th and 21st century. Eva Zeisel, born in Budapest in 1906, was the leading designer of mass-produced ceramic dinnerware of the 20th century. No other ceramic designer can lay claim to such a high degree of activity in so many countries for such a long time. From pre-World War I Hungary and the Golden Twenties in Germany to 1930s Stalinist Russia and ultimately New York City, her extraordinary life reflected moments of artistic ferment, political upheaval, and cultural revolution. Similarly, her 85-year career, which began in 1926, bore witness to the to the century's stylistic trends, from the arts and crafts movement and art moderne to the German Deutsche Werkbund and Bauhaus, the international style, and modernism in all its permutations. Through her unwavering commitment to ceramic mass production, Eva Zeisel's designs shaped the look of the century. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2011 at the age of 105, designing to her very last day. And with this introduction, I'm very pleased to welcome Jean Richards, actress, children's book author, and daughter of Eva Zeisel. Jean, welcome to today's program. I can't believe that we've known each other for 24 years, since 1996 when I first came to work as your mother's assistant when I was in graduate school.
That's
Welcome.
true.
So what an incredible life your mother has led, and you have been a significant part of that. I remember when I worked for Eva, even afterwards, when I would have dinner with her, you were the first person that she spoke to in the morning and the last voice that she heard at night. You know, your bond is so strong, and you can see it. And it's been interpreted through design, in particular the town and country line with the salt and pepper shakers that nestle and embrace one another like mother and child. But your mother has credited her grandmother and her mother as being the source of her independent spirit, which I know is also led to your independence and also to your granddaughter. So can you tell us a little about Eva's family?
Sure. Before I start, though, Ron, I wanted to congratulate you on the exhibit. It is so beautiful, and I'm sorry, of course, that a lot of people aren't seeing it now. And objects that I have seen all my life, suddenly I thought, oh, they're beautiful. And it's the way you did the lighting and the setup. Really, really, you're very talented.
The work speaks for itself. Thank
Okay.
you. I'll accept the compliment, Jean.
Good. So you wanted to know about Eva's family, her grandmother and her mother. First of all, her family was Hungarian, and they were in Budapest. She grew up in Budapest, and her her family was very intellectual. Her grandmother, her uncles, they all became famous economists and philosophers and scientists. And she said, I was the dumb one. I absolutely was not intellectual at all. I found a letter which described their dinner table when she was young, where they discussed the pros and cons of Immanuel Kant. So this was a very intellectual family, and they discussed art and Adolf Loos and architecture, all kinds of things. Anyway, she was not an intellectual, but she was very talented in drawing and painting, and from an early age did drawings and paintings and went to the graduate school, Royal College of Art, whatever that was in Budapest, as a painter, and did many paintings, but then decided, I think in consultation with her mother, that this would be a lonely life to be a painter, and you'd be alone in your garret painting your paintings. And she needed a way to support herself, which might not be through painting. I wanted to say that the grandmother and the mother, her mother, were ardent feminists. Really, her mother would give lectures on in 1905 or whatever on equal pay for women and all kinds of things. And they paved the way for her to not be a feminist. She really wasn't. She just assumed she could do whatever she wanted to do because they had set this precedent for her. So then she decided she needed a way to earn a living and that she would learn a craft. And at that time, there was one medieval guild left in Budapest. It was you know the name of it. I forgot it. Read the name of it.
Yes. So,
Guild of
yes.
Chimney Sweeps.
Eva became the first woman member of the Guild of Chimney Sweeps, Oven Makers, Roof Tilers, Well Diggers, and Potters.
Yes, and she actually became an apprentice, which was a very unusual thing for a middle-class lady to do, but she did, and learned ceramics from the ground up, from mushing the clay with her feet. And she said, I had to sit up all night with the son who was supposed to watch the kiln and make sure the kiln didn't go out. And every time it did, I was supposed to give him a shove to make the kiln go. And she went to market with the pieces. And then she graduated as a journeyman, which she had judges watching her, etc. And her master, the master of the guild, Mr. Karapunchik, suggested that perhaps she bring from home a couple of demi-johns of wine for the judges. But I'm sure she would have passed anyway.
It always helps to grease the wheels.
That always helps. So she became a journeyman, graduated as a journeyman potter.
Well, so she sounds, again, very, very much of an independent spirit. And just to go back, just to put this in context for our audience, for those who don't know, Eva's family, I guess, would you consider upper middle class, bourgeois? I mean, they had an estate in Budapest, they traveled. Eva had governess from a young age.
She had many governesses, and they were, yes, I would call them upper middle class. There was, through the generations, there was a unfortunate pattern of having a lot of money and then suddenly none. And Eva's parents did exactly that. At a certain point, they had a lot of money and governesses, and her father bought a beautiful house in Budapest with land that I think had belonged to the chief gardener of Budapest. So it had all kinds of fruit trees and vineyards, and she eventually made her own pottery there and slept outside under the trees, and it was lovely way to grow up.
I mean, well, growing up in that lifestyle, I've heard about your grandmother's, artistic and intellectual salons where she invited the most prominent people for these events, as you had mentioned, to just discuss these intellectual pursuits.
The salon was actually run by my great-grandmother.
Oh, okay.
Cecil Mama, she was called. She was well known. She had weekly salons with various young artists and writers and whatever. And then her daughter, my grandmother, Eva's mother, she was very interesting. She was interested in, she first of all was one of the first people to get a PhD at the university, first women to get it, and she got it in history. But she was very interested in psychology. Freud at the time was just coming into fashion. And in fact, she and her mother at different times visited Mr. Freud. The story is to tell him that sex was really not the basis of everything. I don't know if she did tell him that, but we found later in Freud's letters a reference to them, and particularly to my grandmother, who was very beautiful, saying, "Oh, the loveliest woman with the most beautiful eyes came to visit me the other day." So, and he wrote that to a colleague. So I picture these two lecherous old gentlemen talking about this beautiful woman who came to see them. But she also, besides being a feminist, she made a kindergarten with all the latest fashions, taught about Darwinism, and had special movement classes and art classes with the best painters. And Eva and her brother were students there in kindergarten.
So it's amazing to go from this, privileged lifestyle to then pursue a practical craft, and then to then venture out on her own to her first job.
In Hamburg was her first job. She put an ad in the paper, a journeyman looking for a job as potter, and she said she wanted to go the farthest away from home. She was always very adventurous. And so she answered this ad from, they saw her ad in Hamburg, a small shop, and she thought that was at least halfway to America. So she took that job. And that was really kind of a shock because it was right next to the red light district. And it was this small shop, and she got there, and there were 4 turntables and several men working on the other turntables. And on her turntable, she liked to say, there was a perfectly formed in clay, as she called it, male organ on her turntable. But she just brushed it aside, and that was fine. So she got their respect. She wasn't shocked.
That was quite an initiation.
Quite
But
an
it shows how
initiation.
that's how she approached life, didn't she?
Absolutely. And I mean, she was a young girl, and maybe she was, whatever, 20 or 19. Anyway, so that was her initiation. And then she made friends with the people who worked there, one of whom was an old bow-legged sailor with a hunchback, I think. And he protected her, and she would, in order not to offend him, go out afterwards for a beer or a sandwich. And she's like to say that he smelled very bad. So she would bring her 4711 eau de cologne to work, pour it on top of him, and he thought that was just wonderful. And I still use 4711 cologne. But so she worked there as a potter, and she was almost fired because the master noticed that she didn't make the vases exactly the same, which a potter is supposed to do. Before he fired her, he did notice that she made things very different and imaginative. So he kept her on to design different shapes, which she did there.
So that's how she started her career as a designer.
No, as a potter. Well, as a designer, yes.
So
But her next job really was as a designer. She answered an ad for a small town in the Black Forest called Schramberg, and there was a big factory there for ceramics. And on the way on the train, she went up on the train with a friend, and the friend showed her how to use a protractor and a compass and to design on paper, not just make models with your hands. So when she arrived there, they said, would you like to make models or design? She said, of course, design, which she did. And she stayed there about 2 years almost and kept 250 workers busy making her designs. She made a lot of designs there.
I also remember reading that she said it was very lonely. So she then sought.
Yes, she lived in a little room. It was a very small town. And she had a little room up, like maybe nearby. And she was so lonely that at one point she made friends with a little mouse who would come and when she was drawing and look at her little pencil. And yes, it was very lonely. And then she made a big jump and went to Berlin. By the way, I told you the reason that she left Schramberg.
No.
They wouldn't put her name under the pieces she designed. So
Wow.
she already knew how important that was if she was going to have a reputation. And hmm?
I was to say she is, yes, she was always very aware of how important it was to promote herself.
Yeah, if she was, exactly. And so then she went to Berlin. Her mother had rented a studio, an atelier for her and for her brother. It had been the atelier of a famous artist called Emil Nolde. And she also worked there for a factory, but she worked not in the factory. She worked from home. They sent a model maker who lived lower down in the building, and she would put the drawings under the door, and he would show her the models. And then she also traveled to the factories. You want
So
to know about her next step?
her next step, we have so much ground to cover. I mean, just every, so from Germany
Well, in
to,
Germany, it was Weimar Germany. And she saw how decadent and corrupt it was. It was three-penny opera. It was just pre-Nazi times, and George Gross was making these drawings of these awful people, and somebody else was showing the poor people, and it was very, very decadent. And she noticed that the art that came from Russia, the music, the children's books, the Moseyev chorus, the dancers, seemed very fresh, the opposite in contrast to Germany at the time. And she was curious and she was adventurous, and she thought she'd go take a look to see what, as she called it, what was behind the mountain. And she was planning to take a vacation there for a couple of weeks and keep sending drawings back. And she went and stayed for many years. She didn't go back.
and what she was able to accomplish at that age in her late 20s. Was it her late
Yes,
20s?
it was her late 20s. So she was hired by I think the Ceramics Industry Trust in Ukraine. And her first assignment was to go to very far off factories near the Polish border and evaluate them, whether they could make plates or something. I don't know what. She's supposed to evaluate these factories. And she told stories of going in a horse and buggy in the snow with the wolves howling and the big blanket full of fleas, which she had afterwards on her lap, and just wild stories going to these very far out places. And then she was assigned to go and design a set or design dishes at the Lomonosov factory, the Royal Imperial factory that had designed for Catherine the Great. And then she also went to set up an art department in the biggest factory, one of the biggest in the world, called Dulevo near Moscow. And she ended up being an artistic director of the China and Glass Trust of Russia.
Wow.
And then one morning, her mother had been visiting her, and she was living there actually with her brother, who was also working there in a different field. And the knock came on the door early in the morning, and her mother woke her up and said, "There's someone here to see you." And it was the KGB, and they came and they arrested her. And she was totally apolitical. She said, "I always went through life as a tourist. I wasn't a participant in that way." And she was not political at all, but she was falsely accused of a successful attempt to assassinate Stalin. And when she said, "But if it was so successful, how come he's alive?" They said, "Don't make bad jokes." And she, in the beginning, she thought it was just some kind of mistake, I'll be out in a few days. But she wasn't. She was in for a year and a half, a year of which it was in solitary confinement, and the other half with all kinds of very colorful roommates. And she, in fact, one can read her prison memoirs in an Apple book, I think it is, an electronic book, um, or Kindle, but the more complete one is for uh, iPad, iBook, Apple computer, and it's called Eva Zeisel, A Soviet Prison Memoir. And you can look it up. It's a good read, and it's not at all gruesome. It's full of funny things and stories.
Well, from what I understand, she was also accused of ferrying documents to Trotsky in
But
Paris, wasn't
that
she?
came later, yeah. But everything was just false, and she kept her dignity and told the truth while she was being interrogated in this really rather awful way. She wasn't tortured physically, but she had a personal interrogator. We found out recently that before she really had her regular interrogator, someone came for about a week and talked to her, and she said it was as if he really wanted to find out if I had done this or not, because the other regular interrogator just wanted her to admit that she had done it, which she hadn't. Um, but this guy she described as very interesting and attractive and nice to her. Well, we found out recently that he was sent by Stalin
Hmm.
to interview Eva to see if indeed Stalin was in danger from her. And he went and he reported to Stalin that no, he was not in danger from her. But still, they kept her in prison for another year and a half.
And didn't her experiences serve as inspiration for one of her childhood friends, to write a book?
It turns out that one of the people who had been in her mother's avant-garde kindergarten with Eva was Arthur Koestler, who wrote Darkness at Noon. And they were friends. First, they were friends in kindergarten, then eventually they were lovers, and then stayed really good friends all their life, all his life and her life. I saw a letter from him to her which said, I feel closer to you than I have to anyone else. And when she got out of prison, she ended up in England where he was. He had also been in prison in Spain. And she told him all her experiences and the details and the people she knew from Russia and from the prison. And many, many of those details, and even one of the main characters, are based on Eva's experience, written up in Darkness at Noon. Although she never wanted her name associated with it. She was always nervous about making this whole Russian prison thing public.
Well, I
Till
know that even at the beginning, for example, when I'm skipping ahead to the
Mhm.
Design for Industry exhibition and catalog, from what I understand, Eva did not want her Russian experiences in that biography. And if you look at it,
Yeah.
it's just one sentence. I think she went to
Yes,
Russia
there
and
was a
then,
big argument with the gentleman who was writing the biography, and she said, "No, no, no, don't tell." She was very well. First of all, one can imagine that it's a pretty awful experience that you don't want to remember. But also, people had been followed in America, the KGB. They had been killed. She just was afraid, and didn't want it made public, and also she didn't want the focus to be on that rather than her designs.
right.
She's kind of right, because once the way finally somebody convinced her to go public with it, and it was a woman who was a very nice woman, Susanna Lassard, who was writing a profile of Eva for the New Yorker, and then she told it all, and that was the first time that she really did. Now, we as children always heard the wonderful stories about how she was in prison and what happened, and her roommates and her mother and how she got out, all those things, but in public it was the first time in the New Yorker.
So then from this incarceration and this suddenly being expelled, I mean, her story continues to be very dramatic. Um,
Well, she went back to Vienna where her family was and her future husband, my father, was, and was slowly recovering, was going to work again. And Hitler marched in. And she said, I can't stand two of these things. It's too much. And the day Hitler marched in, she got the last train out and she just left. And she ended up in England, and where my father joined her a bit later. And from England, after they were in England for a few months, 6 months, something like that, they sailed for America with $64 between them.
but within a few years, she was, I mean, she had achieved an a lot. I mean, so she arrived. What year did they arrive in?
38. They arrived in 38. And what Eva did was she went to the library and found a magazine called, I think it was called Crockery and Glass. And she made an appointment with the editor, who you remembered her name as
Madeline Love.
Madeline Love. And she said, I'm a designer, I'm a very good designer. Or whatever. Do you have any, just arrived, do you have any ideas of contacts for me? And indeed, through Madeline Love, she got a few small jobs designing, I think, a children's tea set and some other things. And somehow through that, she was working at Pratt Institute in their plaster department, plaster room. I believe she was working with someone, one of the jobs was to make plaster Himalaya mountains as a background for movies or something like that. And the head of the industrial design department at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn noticed her. I don't know how he found out about her work and talent. And he invited her to teach at Pratt. And she invented a new course, which was taught in the industrial design department, which was ceramics for industry, not craft, not just sit and make nice things, but ceramics for industry. And she made a syllabus and was a very good teacher. Many of her students were older because they came with the GI Bill. And that she taught there till from 38 to 52. Excuse me. And now comes the New Jersey connection. She has a real nice New Jersey collection. There was a factory in Trenton, New Jersey called Bay Ridge Specialty Company. And she wanted her students to be able to see their designs through to the final product. And Bay Ridge agreed that they would make her students designs that they had drawn and maybe made models for. And they could watch the whole process of molds and models and plaster molds and whatever, and firing and glazing to the final process, final step. And at the same time, Eva designed a set there, which is very beautiful, which is on display in your lovely exhibit. Beautiful.
Yes, it's a very rare set on loan from Leslie Ho.
Yes.
It's beautiful cobalt blue glaze and gilding. It's sort of, I think the design shows a transition between her Russian work and then what would be sort of her American style, which would be followed by the museum line.
Yeah, yeah. So somebody from the Museum of Modern Art, his name was Elliot Noyes. I think he was the design director, somebody very high up there, came to an exhibit of Eva's student work. Maybe her work was there too, but I know it was student work in Rockefeller Center. These were the kids who had done the designs at Bay Ridge Specialty Company in Trenton. And they must have struck up a conversation, and they had a big discussion about the difference between potting as a craft and potting for industry, ceramics. And somehow after that, Eva gave a lecture on this subject at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I think is quite a coup for someone who had just come recently. I don't know how it came about, but she invited Elliot Noyes to the lecture. And after that, he said they were looking for a designer to design the first modern, undecorated dinnerware set in America after the war, and they to be produced by Castleton China and approved by the Museum of Modern Art, and they invited her to design it. And they wanted to.
I'm sorry, it was significant because it was the first formal porcelain dinnerware service for the American market that was under the auspices of the Museum of Modern Art. There was a Hellman, I believe is the name of the factory owner in
Yes.
Castleton in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And it was a first where a manufacturer, a museum, and a designer collaborated together. And this was at a time when the Museum of Modern Art was acting as an arbiter for good design. So this was significant.
Yes.
And the work was...
The set was supposed to be very elegant. It was very expensive. And it was supposed to be like an heirloom, that it would be an heirloom. And the museum had to approve every piece. She told me they didn't ever ask for changes, but there were some pieces that were included in the final set and some that weren't. I have the ones that weren't here, actually. I think are they in your exhibit?
No.
No, but anyway, I have them. And they're still in their collection, and they show it quite often. That's the museum, known as the museum shape. And that really put her on the map as a designer, because they showed this set in I can't say one-man show, one-woman show. They had never had a one-woman show at MoMA, and they had one for Eva called, what was the name of it? Designer.
I think it was called Modern China, Eva Zeisel, New Ceramics by Eva Zeisel.
Yeah, something like
I forget.
that.
It was, yeah.
It was the set, beautifully set up. And it was got a lot of publicity, and it was a show at the Museum of Modern Art just for her set and her. And after that, they invited her very often. You said they were discussing taste. They had a lot of roundtable discussions. What is good design, and is ornament good design, and all kinds of questions. And she was invited to be on these panels.
So the title of the exhibition was New Shapes in Modern China, designed by Eva Zeisel. Yes, designed by Eva Zeisel. So yeah. Again, she saw the benefit of promoting herself, but that they included her name.
Well, certainly her name. I mean, she knew that was very important. And it was later on the bottom of all the sets she designed, her name.
So then subsequently, I mean, I like to compare the formal elegance of the museum line with a line that came out a year later in 1947 by Red Wing Pottery in Minnesota.
That was the opposite of an elegant heirloom design. When she was commissioned, the people who commissioned her said what they wanted. I mean, more or less. It wasn't just that she invented something for whichever factory. So this was a factory in Red Wing, Minnesota, on the Mississippi River, where she did, by the way, visit the factory and go catfishing with the head of the factory in the Mississippi River. And they said, we have very bad clay. It doesn't really last, and we depend on trendy designs. So please design something Greenwich Village-y. And she thought that was odd that the middle of Minnesota wanted something Greenwich Village-y, but she certainly gave it to them. And it was you can describe this, that it was in many, many colors to be mixed. And
And I actually
You describe it.
have a few props here just for the
Okay.
audience, for those of you who may not be familiar with the line. But first, I wanted to show you the salt and pepper set.
Yes, from that set.
So here is the salt and pepper, where the
The big
two,
one is the salt, the little one is the pepper, and they are mother and child, and they are based on Eva and me. They are mother and child. I guess I must have been 7 when she did this design. And they're, by the way, still on the market. Those. Oh, should we tell what they're called? We call those the salt and pepper shakers the schmooze, because a year later, after she designed these, Al Cap did a comic strip where the main characters were schmooze. He called them schmooze, and they looked like that, but they were alive. I mean, in the comic strip.
Mhm.
And so we assume he got the idea from the salt and pepper shakers, and we took his name, and now they're just called the schmooze.
Well, I think it's interesting from you see it very clearly in the museum line, and then subsequently in Town and Country, where Eva designs in families of shapes. It's not just one shape, for example, a circle that is then replicated in different sizes. She makes these adaptations to every design so that they have these relationships, but they're not identical to each other.
Absolutely. She said that when you design, she never designed a single thing by itself, at least 2, so that there was a relationship. But she said that when you design, or when she designed a set, which many things were a full set, they didn't have to be brothers and sisters, but they had to be at least cousins. And they had to be with variety, but they had to be related to each other. And she wanted them to have relationships with each other, and also to be not only beautiful, but touchable, nice to touch and hold. That was very important for her.
And it was
So,
these soft lines and these curves which we associate with organic modernism, but you know, Eva really excelled at that. So just another prop from the
okay.
line. So I have 3 of their pictures here. So here is a creamer and a medium-sized pitcher. I don't know if you can tell, but the handle just changes ever so slightly. It's very practical. So for the
Do you want to
creamer,
show how you were supposed to hold it? Put your hand, not that way.
so oh,
Put
what
your
am I
hand at the base of it.
yes.
Run.
How am I supposed to? Oh, so I'm learning. What am I doing wrong?
All right. Take your hand and put that handle. Yes.
Wait.
You can't describe it.
No, we didn't practice
We
this.
didn't practice this. But this is the set, the Greenwich Village set.
Yeah.
Town and Country was the name of it.
Yes. Okay.
Anyway, it's very round and has many humorous aspects. And the plates, for example, are not parallel to the table. One side's a little higher than the other, and it's quirky and Greenwich Villagey.
It's a little asymmetrical. So but then her career blossomed and led to the Hallcraft line.
That was really her most successful set, and I think the only one where she actually made some money, because this Town and Country set, I think she got $300 to do it. But she just loved designing. So whether she made money or not, she just couldn't be stopped from designing. But then she designed 2 sets for the Hall China Company called Hallcraft. And that was, for a year or 2, the best-selling set in the country. And something beautiful, but something that could be used every day as well as on Sundays. And a lot of people bought it, and it eventually had a whole lot of decorations, some of which were under Eva's aegis and some weren't. And it was very widely bought.
Well, so from what I understand from the royalties, because of the success of that line, she was able to purchase the property in New City, where
I'm sitting right now. Yes, she bought remember, she had grown up with this magic place in Budapest that her father had bought. And she was looking for a house in the country. Actually, her brother had a house nearby, and the children, my cousins and we all played together. So she thought it would be nice to have a house nearby. And she found a huge, pretty huge, big kind of rundown, uh, uh, lovely old house that had been added onto on a road, on a rural road, only about an hour from New York. A lot of artists on the road and wild roses like Sleeping Beauty growing in the back all over. And she bought the house, and she bought it for $12,000 in 1952. And the story is that my father had been in England that summer, um, and on business, and he came back and he said, I have to confess, I splurged. I bought a set of leather suitcases. And she said, you think you splurged? I bought a house. And it's true. And everybody who lived in this house added something, subtracted something, including Eva.
Speaking of who lived there, I know there's this really amazing story that when I first heard, I said, no, that must be somebody else. But
Well, the house came with right nearby on the same property, what we called the garage apartment. It was a garage with one room on top and one room behind it. And she often rented that out. But at a certain point, she decided to redesign that house. And she did it in a very funny way. It took her a lot of years. She would work on it and then run out of money and put a big tarp over it and then work on it again. And many students of hers worked on it, and many others. And she would go to auctions and buy things like skylights or tiles that somebody hadn't paid their taxes on. They're, coming into the country. And then she'd bring them home and think, now where can I put these? That nothing was ever on paper. Anyway, it turned into a very nice kind of split level, maybe 6, 8 levels house, and very quirky. And she rented it after it was all finished. She rented it to a young man who was commuting to New York, paid the rent a little late, and he had something to do with commercials. And he had a boyfriend who did not go commute. He stayed in the house and played the piano kind of more or less all day. And sometimes he'd play the piano so much that Eva would say, do you mind closing the windows? And one day, Eva was sitting, looking up in the mountain behind the house, and there were 4 very strangely made up gentlemen getting photographed. Well, it turned out that the piano player, Sean, and his friend, Guy, had invented KISS. Sean was the artistic director. He did invented the makeup and the look and the songs. And Guy was the producer. So KISS was born in our garage apartment.
the rock band, for those of you who don't know, with the makeup and everything, was your neighbor.
Absolutely, they were the neighbors. They were invented there, and then they did pay their rent on time. In fact, the producer showed up in a Mercedes, and then I don't know if it was that Christmas or the Christmas after. We were, by the way, very famous. Everyone said, "Oh, KISS is there. Could you get us a, I don't know, flag or a T-shirt or something?" And at a certain point, they came over to us, the producer and Sean, and they said, "Look, we would like to have a Christmas party for KISS and their family, the guys, but our room, it's really too small. Could we have it in your living room?" And at one point, a singing teacher had added a big room, 30 by 40, onto this house, which she used as a singing studio. So Eva said, of course, she loved to have big parties. So KISS had their Christmas party in our living room. And what Eva and I both know. Oh, by the way, the producer took us to Eva and me to the city to see them perform.
Madison Square Garden, is that where you went?
Madison
Or-
Square
yeah.
Garden, right, and watch them perform. And he said, "Oh, one of them was drunk. I had to push him onto stage." He was their manager. Anyway, they had a very nice Christmas party, and both Eva and I noticed a funny thing, which is that their parents were the most normal, sweet little people that you would find in a small town. I mean, not at all bizarre. And we enjoyed it very much. And that was KISS, grew up right here. It was invented right here. Eventually, the two boys moved out. I think they moved to not Trump Tower, but the Greek Tower. And they went up in the world. But that was the KISS story.
Well, and then, gosh, Jean, I think we only have a few minutes left. There are so many stories that you can tell. I know that we were planning on taking a few questions, but gosh, I know when we were talking about, Eva's time in Chicago, but then there was the resurrection of her career. Perhaps
We could make it very quick.
do you want to do it as quickly as you want, but perhaps we should jump ahead to, the mid 1960s.
She stopped working for a while. Actually, the whole ceramics industry kind of closed up in America because of Asian imports. And she stopped working and decided to work on a historical project. It was an event or a time in New York City in 1741, when there were a lot of fires, and by chance in the city in the middle of winter, and the people decided that, or not the people, the aristocrats of the town decided that it was the slaves who had set the fire on purpose and wanted to kill everyone and take over the town. And it ended up with many slaves burned at the stake and hung, and it just awful. And one of the reasons she was interested in it is she felt that the interrogation of these slaves who were innocent, she proved that they were totally innocent and the fires were accidental, that it was very similar to the interrogation of innocent people in Russia when she was in prison, and to how she was interrogated, like, we won't kill you if you give us a name, techniques like that. And so she got deeply involved in that for a long time, but then went back to designing. She designed after that in Japan and in India and in Hungary. She went back to Hungary, designed several sets in Hungary, one of which is on the market now. We'll talk about that later. And she gave up her studio at a certain point and moved to Chicago. My father had gotten a very interesting job at the University of Chicago. He was a professor of law and sociology and combined them in very interesting ways, Hans Zeisel. And she moved to Chicago. And there, she didn't have a studio, but a woodworker came to help her build some kind of desk or something in the apartment, and she couldn't be held back from designing. So she started working with that woodworker, and for the next 10 years, excuse me, designed wonderful furniture, wooden furniture, several pieces which were sold. I think one was at Design Within Reach, a beautiful oval coffee table. And she designed office and other kinds of furniture. And
So
have we jumped? What did we leave out?
Ahead too, because as there was the
Ron,
Designer for
can you hear
Industry
me?
exhibition.
Help, Ron.
Can you? Jeannie, can you see me? Your feed has frozen. Can you hear me?
Ron froze. Oh, did he unfreeze?
Okay.
You
We're both
unfroze.
frozen. Okay, now you're unfrozen.
Okay, good. We
You
were
see
both
now?
frozen. We're
Okay,
okay. We were frozen, but we thawed.
okay. And then so there was the Designer for Industry exhibition from
Yeah.
1984, which then toured around the United States
And around the world.
and
And
around the world. And then
Montreal
that led,
yeah. It was a 50-year retrospective of her designs. And that, of course, and that led to the New Yorker article profile and again to designing a lot of things. It again made her well known. It was a lovely exhibit.
so, and then the that led to her going back to visit, as you said, Hungary and Kispester, and then producing that UFO or UFO line that has now been reintroduced in
UFO?
2009. It
What
was
did it have to do with
UFO. I think it's UFO.
I
That's what
never
I thought I remember. The sketches. Anyway, we'll take a look at the catalog. Maybe I could be misremembering.
maybe,
But then
maybe.
she went back to Germany. They named to Schramberg, where they named a lane after her.
They
But then she
named
went
us
back to Russia. So maybe you can talk
yes.
about that.
In the
And then we
year
do have a question from the audience.
okay,
So,
we'll do Russia very quickly. In the year 2000, she was invited back to Russia by the factory where she had worked when she was in 1930. And first of all, she said, and also, by the way, the exhibit was shown there in St. Petersburg, the 50-year retrospective. And she said, well, I will only go back there if you get me a letter that says, because she was officially expelled from Russia. And she said, I'm not risking anything. You have to get me a letter saying that I am exonerated, I was innocent, and I'm allowed to go back. And she got the letter. And then she said, well, I'm way too old to travel alone, so I have to take my daughter, my son-in-law, and my granddaughter with me. So all of us went to St. Petersburg. And it was very touching and very lovely. In fact, we were told that everybody in the factory had died during the siege except one young boy. And that young boy was now an older man, and Eva met him. It was very, very touching. And Eva sat down because she always designed. She just couldn't stop designing. And she was invited to critique their designs, not to design anything, but she immediately found a wonderful model maker. They sat down together and she designed, I think, the most beautiful set she's ever done. Then they sent him here to finish it, Georgy Bogdovich, and it's on the market. It's very, very beautiful. Bone
I remember she was talking about the translucency, and it could be, made
when you
very,
hold
very thin. It's like
when you
paper
hold
thin.
it up to light, it just you see through it. It's like frozen milk. It's just gorgeous.
So we do have one question here,
Yeah.
which I will read. How did Eva view other ceramic designers of the same period? For example, Russell Wright or others. Did she feel competitive? Did she admire any other designer's work?
Well, the main other designer in her time was Russell Wright. And I think they had a kind of friendly competition. The coincidence was that Eva, my brother, and Russell Wright's daughter were in the same kindergarten class or school first grade class, and often the two of them would be sitting there in parent-teacher conferences at Hunter College Elementary School. It was they admired each other, and it was a slightly friendly competition. They were friendly with each other, and he was actually much more successful, I mean, in terms of sales than she was in general. But it was a wary friendship. Sometimes once one of her assistants went over to work with him, and she didn't like that too much. But but she admired him, and other people, you know, she certainly, a lot of her students became very good designers, and she admired them. But I didn't hear her speak up too much other than of contemporary designers other than Russell Wright. We
You
wanted,
mentioned her students, like, was it Katavalos and Littell were students of hers,
they
perhaps?
were students of hers, and Jerry Galata became a wonderful designer, took over her classes actually when she left Pratt. You know, Ron, we wanted to, I don't know if there's more questions, but we wanted to do two things before we finished. One is say which things were actually now on the market of hers,
Yes,
and
go ahead.
which you can help me remember. Do we have time to do that?
Yes, we have, so you want me to, so right now we do have the granite collection being produced and sold by Design Within Reach.
Right. Design Within Reach has the tea set called Granite. Um, Eva's Eva's grandson, my nephew, my brother's son, Adam Zeisel, has a website where he sells lots of her designs called EvaZeiselOriginals.com, including the salt and pepper shakers. Um, so we have that.
There's
We
some
have
words at the Neue Gallery.
Neue Galerie in New York has a baby feeder and some other things. Klein Reed, lovely company, has vases that
Vases, tea set, sugar creamer. I mean, beautiful, and also the collages, the
and
prints.
collages made on cutouts that they made with Eva's shapes, and they do their own designs. And the only other designer they do is Eva, and they had a wonderful relationship. And Leocos lamps,
Mhm.
which I think are sold by Lumens glass lamps. And
Yes, by Leocos. Um,
what am I missing?
and then introduced posthumously.
Oh, yes, very important. Posthumously are a series of acoustic felt wall tiles. It's mostly for architects and interior designers. Um, they're put out by Filzfelt, which is owned by Spinnybeck. Filzfelt, Filzfelt.
Yes.
And they are Eva's shapes that all go together into patterns, and they come in 63 colors, and they
So
go
which
on
I
the
have
wall.
some of them here behind me.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know if you can see. So they're in the exhibition, but I just artistically
Yes.
arranged some of them. This is, most of the other forms are more, sinuous,
Three-dimensional.
but
Yeah.
these could be stacked as pyramids or side by side like bow ties. We do have another question, Jean.
Yes.
So how did Eva manage to design for so long at a time when women weren't often working?
I think she assumed, having a grandmother and great grandmother who were feminists, that she could really go on her talent and her ability. She didn't like to be referred to as a woman designer, which sometimes there were exhibits of women design. She said, I am a designer, not a woman designer. She did feel that there were some advantages being a woman, that you used the things in the kitchen that you made, and that women maybe could design those better than men because they knew how they used them. There were a couple of times in her life when she was discriminated against as a woman, which I won't. I mean, design situations, but I think she just had the confidence that she was a good designer and she could do it. She also, of course, had children and a husband. And my grandmother very often was our babysitter when Eva had to travel to factories. And she included us very much in these trips, and we had a wonderful time growing up. But I think she just assumed that she was a designer and a good designer and could do it. Do you think, Ron?
Jean, I think that we have the film that we will be showing after this. So unless there was, you wanted to
There
do
was
one
one
more
more
thing?
thing I
Yes.
wanted to include.
Yes.
Can I?
Oh, please, please, of course.
Okay. When I was 10 years old, Eva wrote me a poem about life. And I wanted to read some of it because it's so much her character. And it says, It's life you are living, and life is here. It's not sometime later, it's now, Jeannie dear. It's life when the sun shines, it's life when it rains. It's not where you are going, but riding the trains. And then I'll skip a few, and it says, don't think that once will come a day when all be rich and smart, and laughter will be here to stay, and then real life will start. Between the not yet gilded past and the time for which we strive lies unnoticed and not to last, the moment which is life. Isn't that beautiful? Makes
That's
me cry.
lovely. That's lovely.
And she taught me that, and I live by that.
Well, thank you, Jean. You have a comment that's beautiful, Jeannie, from Scott Vermillion.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
For our audience, we are going to have a 5-minute intermission, and we will play the slides that were running earlier. We will have 5 minutes, and then we will show the film Throwing Curves, Eva Zeisel. So that would be from director and producer Jill Johnstone captures the extraordinary story of industrial designer Eva Zeisel in her own words. From her birth in Hungary in 1906 through her early career in Germany, in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and life in New York in the 1940s and onward. The film interweaves Zeisel's design work with her dramatic biography, which included 16 months in a Soviet prison, as you heard, escaping the Nazis and emigrating to New York to set up a new life. It also explores the tension between modern motherhood and her career as the foremost ceramic designer of the 20th century. So, Jeannie, thank you. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Ron. It's lovely to see you, even long distance. And I hope people get a chance to see the exhibit because it's really beautiful.
It was really special for me to be able to do this. I think that
we wish each other goodbye.
Such a pleasure, Jeannie.
Thank you.
We will have a 5-minute break.